Where there's a trial, there are witnesses. Witnesses who tell what they saw, what they heard, what they sensed. The truth, at least as it seemed from where they stood. Witnesses help us see from other vantage points. Witnesses help us understand if we're willing to really listen. At times, it's as if we were there. We can connect with the story, and witnesses then can help us tell our own story. There's a trial coming. It's Lent. In 6 weeks, we'll be hearing of the arrest, torture, trial, and execution of Jesus. There were a few witnesses. There were many more who could have been witnesses, should have been witnesses. Many more whose lives were impacted, more who had parts to the story, parts of the truth to share. It's time their stories were heard. Each week for the next 5 weeks, we'll be hearing those stories, telling those stories as best we can imagine them. On that 6th week, that week right before the trial, it'll be time for us to share our stories. I pray it will open our eyes to the lives that surrounded Jesus, the way Jesus has impacted their lives and our lives, and how we can impact lives today, too. My name is John. I'm the son of Zechariah and Elizabeth, cousin of this man, Jesus. I don't know if you'd call it an alias, but many know me as the baptizer or the Baptist. This is my testimony. I'm kind of the ultimate PK, that is, priest's kid. My father, Zechariah, was a priest in the temple and so would go to Jerusalem to serve with his division for a week or so at a time. My mother, Elizabeth, was a descendant of Aaron. Yes, the Aaron, the brother of Moses, the first priest for all the Hebrews. We were a very religious family. My parents were always teaching me that God could do more than we humans expect him to do, more than we humans let ourselves believe. They always warned me of looking at God only when I expected to see him, looking for God in only those special places. See, I was something of a miracle baby, born after my parents figured kids weren't in the cards for them. My dad didn't believe it at first. In fact, he full-on doubted that God could work with them as they were. I don't know what happened when he first found out that Mom was pregnant. He was in Jerusalem at the temple or something. But Dad was stunned silent until after I was born. From then on, he never doubted. Right up until his deathbed when I was a teenager, he was always looking for God, the ways that we were supposed to respond to God in the world. He told me that we understood in ways that others didn't, that I was going to have to guide people to the right path, guide people to God for the rest of my life. It sounded like a big deal, but I didn't really get it at the time. After my parents died, I got involved with this group out in the desert, an Essene community out in Qumran. Sure, they were a little different than my parents, and I was a little younger than most people who joined, but I felt like I fit pretty well in that community. They weren't as interested in the way things were. They didn't want to apologize and blend into the Roman culture around us, but focused more on boiling down to the basics of Judaism, separating ourselves from society so that they could strip down to what really mattered, you know? As an idealist, as someone who had been raised to know our Jewish history really well, I got it. It made sense to me. In the Essene Manual for Discipline, the book that guided our bare bones life, there was a passage from the prophet Isaiah. I brought it with me today. It says, "And when there becomes the community in Israel according to these rules, they shall separate themselves from the midst of the habitation of perverse men, of everybody, to go into the wilderness to prepare there the way of God, as it is written, in the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord, level in the wasteland a highway for our God." That's what we were doing. We were separating ourselves from everyone else, everyone who got it wrong, living separately, cleaning up our act with the hope that God was coming. Lord knows no one else was. Some of the priests in Israel only cared about being related to Abraham, about being from the right family, as if that was all that mattered. If that's all that mattered, I could have done anything I wanted. I was related to Aaron. Of course, even though they came from the right family, that didn't change how they acted at all. The Pharisees, they were the worst of them. They acted as if they were the only Jews that cared about God. They were such hypocrites. If they're the only ones who do our religion right, then we have a rotten religion. Gosh, I can't stand them. I was glad to be so separate from them. Essenes, on the other hand, we focus a lot on actions. Now, it's not as if they're perfect, but always trying at least to stay in a sort of cleanliness for God. We would cleanse ourselves in water whenever we realized that we did something that wasn't up to God's standard. We tried desperately to stay away from things that were sinful or impure, as we'd call them. We ate really restricted diets and stayed apart, stayed by ourselves. But as I got older, I found a problem with that, though. I realized that when we stayed really isolated, we weren't building anything. I ended up leaving Qumran when I turned 30 or so. I was thinking, how could we possibly prepare the way of the Lord if we're staying by ourselves? I wanted to bring what we thought, that it was about more than who we were, but how we acted, to everyone. I started baptizing, bringing this ritual of purification to the Jordan River, calling people to repent, to turn around, to change their heart and mind, to live differently than they had been. And let me tell you, things in that area had gotten bad. I mean, people had so much stuff. It wasn't the way that we thought it should be. People had extra clothes and extra coats, even when there were other people that didn't have enough. Tax collectors would skim extra money off of the top of their collection. Soldiers would make false accusations in order to make their quotas. So I baptized them and helped them change their ways. I changed it from an always thing to a one-time thing. It worked too. People got excited. People even started thinking I was the Messiah, the one that we were all waiting for. Now, they were wrong, of course, and I told them that. But still, people were willing to change their ways and avoid all of those impure thoughts. It was exciting. The guys in charge, they got mad at me, of course, but I didn't really like them anyway. And anyway, it was worth it. I've known Jesus forever. Like, we knew each other before we were born. Our mothers were cousins. Jesus came to be baptized by me one day in the Jordan, even though he totally didn't need to. It's not like he'd done anything wrong. Ever, actually. If I think about it, yeah, I don't think he's ever done something wrong. But that's who Jesus is. He was willing to face the grime. He was always into looking into the dirt of stuff, you know? He wouldn't make a good Essene, even though he never did anything impure. He wouldn't fit in with our community very well. He wouldn't run and hide from the tough and the gross or the bad stuff. He runs toward it to fix it. He wasn't afraid of people who did things wrong, but he went toward them to understand who they were and where they were coming from and how he could help. He'd touch lepers, for goodness sake. His idea of cleanliness and my idea of cleanliness were very, very different. Even after his baptism, after he was baptized in the Jordan, you know, that one that he didn't really need, he went into the wilderness and allowed himself to be tempted. He wasn't going to hide from his temptations or from Satan, but go and live among them, facing himself, facing the animals, and Satan and all of the gross things in this world. But because of that, because of his willingness to face that stuff, he was always a better people person than I was. He understood where people were coming from. And so they would always come to him with their stories. They would always go to him for help. And he was always there, willing to help, heal, cure, listen, or all of the above, really. I like staying separate. But I am glad that there's someone out there who's willing to face the grime. Jesus isn't a guy who hides from the tough stuff in life. He's not afraid to hear the hard stories. And they never seem to scare him off as much as I think they will. He faces it head on and somehow convinces us that whatever it is, whatever is wrong in our lives, it doesn't control us. That is good news, if I've ever heard it.